A very warm welcome, everyone, to the Maritime Education Podcast. My name is Barry Sadler, and to those of you returning, welcome back. And to those of you who are new to the podcast, thanks for joining us. And I hope you find something that's both interesting and educational within our podcast. Today, I'm going to tackle something that perhaps has slipped a little bit below the average mariner's radar, and that is the IMO's 2025 Net-Zero Framework, and the fact that in the month of October, which is where we are now in 2025, we have an extraordinary meeting of the IMO's MEPC to discuss the implementation of this Net-Zero Framework, which was agreed back in April of this year. So let's talk a little bit about it, introduce it, tell you what it is, tell you what some interim measures are that have been put in place to allow this net zero framework to be discussed and decided, and then to go ahead and talk about the future of the implementation of the IMO's goal of meeting net zero by 2050. In April of this year, the IMO's Marine Environmental Protection Committee, so MEPC. So those of you may have looked at IMO circulars as they come out. They've always got a 4-letter abbreviation before them. Now, some of them are about navigational safety and other matters, safety matters. But the Marine Environment Protection Committee is a committee of the IMO which, as the title suggests, talks about environmental protection. Each one of these committee meetings is numbered, and this is MEPC 83. In other words, it was the 83rd meeting in which it was approved, and therefore everything that comes out of that meeting has an acronym, if you like, MEPC 83 in front of it, so we know where it originated from. At that meeting, the committee approved the draft legal package, informally really called the IMO Net-Zero Framework. And it combines two things. It combines a goal-based marine fuel standard that ratchets down the well-to-wake greenhouse gas intensity of energy that's used on board. I'll talk about well-to-wake later on. And secondly, it introduces a global greenhouse gas pricing reward mechanism. Now, the draft amendments to MARPOL Annex 6 were cleared for circulation with a view to formal adoption at an extraordinary MEPC session in October of this year, which is due to take place in the next couple of weeks. And that's referenced as MEPC ES2. So that's a relation back to what's going to happen in a couple of weeks' time. Now, at the end of the day, the net zero framework that's being introduced delivers what are being seen as mid-term measures. In other words, they are measures that are made on the way to reaching net zero in or around 2050, with a 2030, 2040 checkpoint and a 2030 fuel update target for zero or near zero fuels, in other words, alternative fuels. Now, why does this matter? Well, the main reason it matters is because I think most people are aware that international shipping emits somewhere between 2 and 3% of global greenhouse gases, and that's a significant amount. Now, unfortunately, emissions from the maritime sector have been rising over the past decades, and this makes both regulatory and, to a certain extent, technological action fairly urgent. Now, it also matters, of course, because ships move across international borders, and a global body is required to manage this, and that's why the IMO have taken it on. The IMO is the institutional venue for harmonised rules that apply internationally once adopted by flag states, and this will hopefully prevent fragmentation and, perhaps more importantly, prevent pollution havens. Pollution havens are fundamentally nations that do not enforce things like the Net-Zero Framework, and therefore ships can trade within them without having to worry about the technicalities involved. The IMO tries to reduce pollution havens by bringing on board everybody within the IMO sphere and ensures that all nations are capable of enforcing this. That costs money because not all nations are as well off as others, but we'll talk about where some of that money is going to come from as we go through. Now, this net zero applies to large, basically ocean-going vessels. In other words, specifically vessels of 5,000 gross tonnes and above that are on international voyages. And formal adoption of this is expected at this extraordinary meeting that will happen within the next couple of weeks. But that doesn't mean that it's going to be enforced within the next couple of weeks. That's formal adoption by the IMO and its members. After adoption, we go into the tacit acceptance and ratification period, which will follow. Therefore, it's estimated that entry into force is likely at around 2027, with all major operations being in place by 2028. Tacit acceptance basically means that after adoption by the IMO, those signatory states will be expected to ratify this requirement. In other words, write it into their national legislation. Once written into the national legislation, they declare to the IMO that they are enforcing it. And what tacit acceptance is if so many states representing a percentage of world tonnage adopt these measures into their laws, that means that after a certain follow-on period, it will become enforceable on a global basis. Therefore, any states that haven't yet got round to ratify it need to get their skates on. Let's talk about this phrase, well to wake, because a lot of you probably won't have heard that phrase, but well to wake is a life cycle measurement, and it is a way of calculating the total greenhouse gas emissions of a marine fuel across its entire life cycle. So in other words, from the moment that the raw materials are extracted from the earth all the way until the fuel is literally burned in the ship's engine to produce a wake. It's seen as the most comprehensive method for assessing the true climate impact of a fuel and is now central to the IMO's next generation of these decarbonisation regulations, including the fuel intensity standard under the Net-Zero Framework. Now, there are three main stages of the fuel cycle. First stage is the well to tank. Now, these are our upstream emissions that are created by actually extracting the raw material from the earth, processing that raw material and refining it into a usable fuel, and then transporting and storing that fuel before it's actually bunkered onto the ship itself. That's well to tank. Tank to wake is the combustion emissions. This is where the ship's efficiency comes in. And this relates to emissions that are released when the fuel is actually burned in the ship's engine or fuel cell. And traditionally, this is the bit that has been regulated by the IMO, such as the tiering of engines and the carbon index indicator, which we'll talk about a bit later on. Well to wake basically is the sum of well to tank and tank to wake emissions. And it includes all the major gases that are emitted from fossil fuels. CO2, nitrogen oxide, greenhouse gas, the whole lot is included within this well to wake lifetime emission cycle. So let's go back now to the IMO's Net-Zero Framework and look at the core mechanics, look at how it works. First of all, we need a measurement of that well to wake, and that's called the GHG, or the Greenhouse Gas Fuel Intensity Target, or known as a GFI. And ships must meet annual intensity targets, so that's greenhouse gas per unit of energy, that become increasingly stringent over time. There are two levels of targets that will be applied to ships, a base target and a stricter direct compliance target. And ships compliant with the stricter target may earn what we call surplus units. Now, surplus units are a means of, if you like, paying for the pollution that you emit. So a ship that emits above their allowed intensity must purchase what are known as remedial units from the IMO's Net-Zero Fund. In other words, if that ship emits in its well-to-wake target, if it emits greenhouse gases above that, it's going to have to pay to emit above that. Now, the IMO call it purchase of remedial units from its fund, but essentially it means that a ship owner whose ships are emitting above those intensity targets will have to pay for it. Ships that overachieve, in other words, ships that go beyond that direct compliance target, well, they're different. They can bank what we call surplus units with the IMO. Now, they can use these surplus units to pay off remedial units. So a ship owner may have a very, very efficient ship and a not so efficient ship. The very efficient ship may generate surplus units, which are then banked with the IMO, but the not so efficient ship may at times go over the amount of greenhouse gas per energy unit, and therefore it can use those surplus units to purchase the remedial units. In other words, it will offset the two against one another so that the mean emissions fall in line with the base target. Now, fundamentally, all of this is going to be managed by the IMO. Now, the money obviously won't go directly to the IMO when ships purchase remedial units, but it will be, if you like, managed by the IMO. Now, this form of approach has some really good advantages associated with it. It's fundamentally the first global pricing mechanism within the UN. It's the first time a UN regulatory body has proposed to combine emissions with a pricing, a way of binding shipping to their emissions by, if you like, fining them for going over those emissions. Don't forget, it's not called a fine. Yeah, the ship owner purchases remedial units, but fundamentally, if their ships go over the required intensity, they will need to purchase those remedial units. They'll have to pay for those. It signals for investment. The certainty of this penalty or rewards regime gives clearer signals to ship owners and fuel producers that they need to get their act together, that they need to progress technologies and fuels which back up this reduction in greenhouse gases in order to reduce the amount that they end up paying. In other words, if they want to make money, they're going to have to do so with ships that don't end up purchasing huge amounts of remedial units. The flexibility of the system by using surplus units to pay off remedial units means that ship owners with a broad fleet are not going to be disadvantaged because they can balance one against the other. Now, there have been some limitations and criticisms of this new regime. Some feel that there is insufficient ambition for the 2030 targets that want to be met, and that although this is a start, it's by no means the golden ticket needed to see a reduction in greenhouse gases steady enough to meet the 2050 goal of net zero. There will be a revenue versus cost gap. The projected revenue from the remedial units may not suffice to subsidise or incentivise the uptake of zero or new zero fuels. Now, the money that's in the IMO fund that has been accumulated as ships pay for these remedial units is going to be used for lots of different purposes. Some of the main purposes it's going to be used for are to assist companies in the development of new technology, help out those countries whose own internal national funds do not allow their ships to comply, and try and level the playing field somewhat when it comes to the different flag states. Now, there is a fear that the amount of money paid into this IMO fund isn't going to be enough to subsidise or incentivise the uptake of these fuels. In other words, a ship owner won't be saving enough money by doing so, and therefore may choose to pay the tariff instead of reducing the emissions from the ships. Ship owners will still be able to have suboptimal fuel because the framework doesn't ban fuels that have a high GHG emission rate. They just say that you've got to buy these remedial credits from the IMO. So it doesn't stop the use of diesel, for instance. It just charges ship owners for using it. Some people say that there are gaps in some of the details as to how the whole life cycle accounting is going to be treated. In other words, trying to measure the amount of greenhouse gas that's emitted from the well to tank side of it may be difficult in some countries. There is sometimes a criticism that this type of legislation overlaps with some regional and national regimes in place, such as EU rules on Fuel EU Maritime and the likes. And I think the biggest criticism of all is the potential for this pay to pollute ethos coming through. In other words, if the cost of paying remedial units is cheaper than switching to cleaner technology for some ships, then there's a risk that ship owners will opt to pay rather than invest in decarbonisation. Now, this is a problem right across the board when it comes to net zero, and the ability for the ship owner to continue to make money will always be one of the most important considerations, because decarbonisation should not put people out of business. It is a goal, it is a medium-term wish list, but it should not be used to enforce things upon ship owners that make the running of ships very, very difficult. Now, not everybody's on board with this net zero framework, and in particular the United States has chosen not to be part of this net zero framework at this stage. Now, there's lots of different reasons for them. Most of them are perhaps beyond the interest of those listening to this podcast, your average mariner. But just to name a few, it opposes the global carbon pricing model. The US prefers market-led domestic approaches to this sort of thing. The US likes to use this sort of thing as a negotiating tool to influence the framework's final design by putting pressure on IMO member states in other areas to force them into adjusting this IMO net zero framework to what they want. Obviously, in the States right now, there are domestic political sensitivities around taxation and the likes, and this may be seen as a sort of stealth tax for shipping. And the US is particularly worried about regulatory duplication, particularly in the EU. So for those reasons, the US is not part of the IMO Net Zero framework. And of course, the US being such a huge influencer at UN agencies like the IMO, this is of course a hurdle that needs to be overcome. This is not the first thing the IMO, of course, have done to try and reduce emissions from ships. Over the past decade, the IMO has really made quite a lot of measurable progress, and it's really been setting strategies towards this IMO Net Zero for the past decade, really, where Behind the scenes, climate scientists have been working with the IMO to try and slowly introduce measures that allow the transition to net zero to be less of a shock for the ship owner. Now, one of those recent measures is, of course, the adoption of the carbon index indicator. Now, we talked about this in an earlier podcast. The carbon index indicator, which entered into force in 2023, the IMO categorised it as a short-term GHG reduction measure. Now, short-term to the IMO, 7 to 10 years. Carbon index indicator was a way of measuring just the tank to wake part of the actual greenhouse gas intensity. It didn't look at all at the weld to tank area of it. So basically what the carbon index indicator did was it started to make ship owners think about the amount of emissions that they were putting out by the fuel that they were burning. So twofold here. One, it made ship owners look for more efficient ways of running their ships. Two, new ships were made with much more efficient hulls, propellers and engines. And thirdly, the reporting procedure was put in place in order to highlight those ships that were not making an acceptable band of emissions for the tank to wake part of the GHG measurement. So the carbon index indicator is there to indicate literally how efficient the ship bit of the transport is. In other words, how much greenhouse gas is being emitted by the ship. And ships that emit too much greenhouse gas, that don't meet the band A, B or C of the carbon index indicator, are penalised by the market. But at this stage, they don't have to contribute to any kind of fund in order to buy any remedial credits, because they are found themselves in band D or band E. A ship's whose carbon index indicator falls into band D or band E has a timescale to get themselves out of those bands and into band C, which is considered satisfactory. But there's no financial penalty for it. These were also known as mid-term measures, but although the net zero that we're about to go into is also a mid-term measure, the carbon index indicator took us really from zero and ramped us up towards the net zero ethos that the IMO want to bring into place. But carbon index indicators were only there to bridge the gap between 2023 and the implementation of the Net-Zero Framework. In other words, it bought the IMO time for fuel infrastructure, technology and regulatory systems to mature to the point at which net zero could be adopted by more and more countries. So let's talk about this this pricing or reward mechanism that net zero is based upon. It's a global levy, if you like, on the carbon price, and ships exceeding their fuel intensity target will need to pay for exceeding those targets. Now, the revenue will go into an IMO fund for fuel infrastructure, research and development and support for developing nations. And this new approach mattered mainly because the carbon index indicator offered no financial incentive or penalty beyond corrective plans that must be put into place with the ship's energy efficiency management plan. Pricing does introduce real economic pressure to switch fuels and decarbonise your ships. And therefore, as a short-term measure, the carbon index indicator was there to drive operational efficiency, not penalise people for not even trying. It will be overshadowed by the Net-Zero Framework. It's designed to be replaced by the Net-Zero Framework. But at the end of the day, after 2030, the carbon index indicator will more than likely be retired, be integrated to, or used commercially by ship owners or shippers, but it will no longer be the IMO's primary regulation for controlling greenhouse gases. That will then be the job of IMO's net zero framework. Now, I think a lot of people think, well, hang on a minute, how will the ship owner know what greenhouse gas thresholds their ship will be subject to? How will they know whether or not they have to pay these remedial credits? The allowable well-to-wake greenhouse gas threshold will be written directly into MARPOL Annex 6, which of course is the international treaty governing air pollution from ships. And it will be in there as part of the goal-based fuel standard. The standard itself will specify per year greenhouse gas intensity limits, typically expressed in grams of CO2 or equivalent per megajoule of energy. Now that's different to how we measure it at the moment. At the moment it's generally measured in grams of CO2 per distance travelled, equating to the amount of fuel that is burned. In other words, it's grams of CO2 per tonne per kilometre at the moment, whereas it's going to be grams of CO2 per energy of megajoule. So this means that we're not just focusing on the distance travelled by the ship, we're focusing on every operation the ship's involved in and the energy used in every single operation. Now, these greenhouse gas thresholds will tighten progressively over time, just like the carbon index indicators are tightening progressively over time. And once adopted, these greenhouse gas intensity limits will become legally binding under international laws, and ships that fall within the regulation scope, i.e. over 5,000 gross tonnes on international voyages, will need to comply. But who will ensure they comply? Well, primary enforcement is, of course, with flag states. And under international legislation, the flag state, the country, in other words, where the ship is registered, is always the primary enforcement authority for IMO conventions. And this includes MARPOL Annex 6, where, of course, the greenhouse gas measures will, of course, sit. Now, each flag state will be legally obliged to ensure that its ships comply with the fuel intensity standard and submit verified emissions data and, of course, the pay and any required GHG levies via the remedial units to the IMO themselves. In other words, it will be enforced by and legislated by the flag state. Compliance checks will, of course, be part of annual intermediate surveys, document of compliance reviews for shoreside management and audit processes under the ISM code will also ensure the ship's continued compliance with its GHG intensity limits. If ship owners fail to pay for their remedial units, or they falsify data, or they are found to be over the required GHG intensity limit without declaring so, then all the tools that the flag state has in its arsenal are there to be used. Detention, withdrawal of certificates, loss of class if the classification society get involved, pretty much just like any other MARPOL violation. So it's managed in very, very much the same way. It's just that we had this added complication now that if a ship exceeds its GHG intensity limits, then it's going to have to pay for these remedial credits through its flag state directly to an IMO fund, which will then be distributed. Ships will, of course, be subject to similar checks by port state control officers who can detain or fine the vessel before reporting them to their own flag states for collection of the GHG revenues. In other words, the ship could go into port, have a port state control inspection. The ship will need to declare its GHG intensity limit. The port state officer can then check how much fuel has been burnt, check whether or not the ship is complying with that GHG intensity limit, and if it's not, then let the flag state know, and the flag state will then be obliged to collect those remedial credits, those revenues, those, if you like, whatever you want to call it, stealth tax or penalty that must be paid by the ship owner for their engines emitting more than the greenhouse gas intensity limits. That's a bit of an inaccurate way of saying it, actually. They would have to pay for the fuel going above its GHG intensity limits, because it's not just the engine and the ship. At the end of the day, a GHG intensity limit is a well-to-wake limit. In other words, the ship owner will have to show that not only the burning of that fuel on board the ship falls within the limits, but the actual obtaining of that fuel falls within limits. And that perhaps is going to be the real challenge for both flag and port states as they monitor the GHG emissions that come from the provision of this fuel in the first place. That's probably going to be a lot harder to measure than the actual tank to wake measurement, which we effectively measure at the moment with the carbon index indicator. So that's another reason why that was used as a stepping stone towards the IMO's Net-Zero Framework. There's a lot to get your head around in this new framework, which hopefully will be adopted within the next couple of weeks at the IMO itself. Here we are on the 12th of October 2025, and we expect there to be adoption by the end of October, with these extraordinary meetings of the Marine Environment Protection Committee happening in the next couple of weeks. We'll keep you updated here at Barry Sadler Maritime Training and Consultancy when we see what's happening, and we're also working to try and get interviews and advice from those involved in the actual decision making within this protection committee, and to try and understand the thought processes behind the implementation of IMO's Net-Zero Framework. Hopefully this explains a little bit about a subject which, as I said at the beginning, may have gone under the radar of your average mariner. But it's out there. It's coming in. Ship owners will need to start to think about this very, very soon, as the estimation is that by 2028, this standard will be enforceable internationally, and ship owners will end up having to pay money to buy credits if their ships exceed their GHG emission limits. Thank you very much, everyone, for listening to this podcast. It's great to have you on board, and I look forward to delivering the next one in the very near future. In the meantime, guys, do have a wonderful day.